She is a cultural heritage leader, public historian, and scholar based in Durham. For a decade, she has worked to share stories of the Black Southern experience and to amplify histories of marginalized communities in archives, museums, and historic sites. She earned a Master of Arts in History with a concentration in museum studies from UNC Greensboro. Before joining the Pauli Murray Center, she served as the director of the NC African American Heritage Commission, which is a division of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Let's welcome Angela Mason.
Good evening, everyone. So again, I am Angela Mason, and as you heard briefly, I am a historian. If you're feeling inclined to groan or leave after hearing that, please don't. This is not like high school history class. So I am what is more aptly called a public historian. I study history so that I can share stories in really creative and innovative ways with the public. And I have had the great fortune, again, as you heard, of doing that work in North Carolina for just about a decade. I work specifically to share stories of Black people in the U.S. South and specifically North Carolina, and have done that in museums, historic sites, archives, and even state government, and have the great fortune of doing that work now as the executive director of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray was a Black, queer, gender nonconforming human rights activist in the 20th century. As an attorney and as a legal scholar, Pauli's personal activism and professional work in the 1930s and the 1940s built the foundation for civil rights law in the 1950s and the 1960s, including the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. As a feminist, Pauli was one of the founders of the National Organization for Women and a staunch advocate for the rights of Black women, especially Black working class women. As a poet and an author, Pauli explored the Black American experience, and as the first African American woman to be ordained an Episcopal priest, Reverend Dr. Murray leveraged faith as a reconciliatory tool for our communities. Next slide. Pauli Murray was raised in Durham, not too far from where we are today, in the historically Black working class neighborhood of West End, in a home that was built by their grandfather in 1898 by what Pauli called plain old boards and cast off bricks. In the early 2010s, this structure did not look like what you see on the slide behind me. In fact, it was slated for demolition as the West End community suffered from severe economic disinvestment. Neighbors and local advocates gathered together to ensure that this historic space, again, the place where Pauli Murray was raised, was preserved. And since then, we have led expansive work here. Again, a decade later, we stand in Durham to lift up the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, to inform how we might transform our communities through everyday actions rooted in social justice and in equity. And ultimately, this represents both the power and the potential of preserving Black spaces and spaces that represent other marginalized communities. In the United States, 3% of historic spaces are dedicated to telling the stories of Black people. 1% of historic spaces amplify the stories of women. Less than 1% of historic spaces celebrate the contributions of members of the LGBTQIA+ community. Next slide. Historic spaces are essential to the fabric of our communities. They serve as critical education spaces. They function as third spaces. These are spaces where people can connect to exchange ideas and experience joy and build relationships. Historic spaces impact our economy, as you just heard, especially when you think about tourism dollars and jobs. People like me work in these spaces and work to preserve these spaces. But most importantly, historic spaces often stand alone in representing the heart, essence, and very soul of our community. So, I wonder if you join me in imagining what our communities might be if more people saw themselves represented in historic spaces in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Angela? You go back here.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for your presentation. Since a lot of history is written by those who are in the majority and don't document the experiences of marginalized communities, how can we work today to bring those stories up and make sure that they are celebrated?
That's a great question. I would offer two perspectives. I encourage everyone, but most especially people from marginalized communities, Black people, Black women, queer people, to write their stories. We know so much about Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray's life because they wrote their story. In a memoir, they ensured that their papers were preserved in an archive. That is how historians were able to access their story and share it with the public. It has taken some time, but again, Pauli led around telling their own story. So again, I encourage people from marginalized communities to do that. It is also really important for Black people and people from marginalized communities to be at the forefront of sharing these stories. And so when youth tell me that they want to go to school to study something like history, I encourage them. And sometimes I talk to their parents, right? Because there is a pathway for doing this work professionally. And it is people who look like me who, again, are working diligently to share and amplify these stories. And so, again, the second piece of my answer would be, we have to ensure that our young people have pathways to doing this work professionally. Pathways to graduating from school, going to graduate school to get these professional degrees, but then also pathways to enter this really competitive job market.
Other questions?
With the emphasis on economic development and urban renewal schemes and things like that, there's a serious conflict in ensuring that some of these historical places are kept. But I would like to know how many museums and places like where artifacts and things of historical places are in North Carolina.
Yeah, so I can speak specifically from my perspective of Black heritage spaces in North Carolina, and I'll name that this knowledge comes from my work at the state level as director of the state's African American Heritage Commission. So in North Carolina, we have roughly 222 African American cultural heritage assets in 80 of our 100 counties. So this includes museums, archives, libraries, festivals, and theater companies. And again, this is in most of our 100 counties. They are varyingly resourced. Most of these cultural spaces are under-resourced, but again, if you look, they are there, and they do not simply exist in our large cities like Durham, Charlotte, Greensboro, but again, over 200. The last thing that I'll offer is that in 2014, we documented about 70 African American cultural heritage assets in North Carolina. And North Carolina followed much of the rest of the country after the election of President Obama and the establishment of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You saw a lot more of these spaces being established both in the state and nationally.
Thank you so much, Angela.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.